what became very obvious, it became very obvious in fact under Trump, because Trump did not disguise, as it was done before by previous president, the fact that he's using the law as an economic weapon.
This show has said its piece about Europe's inimical tendency to freeload on everything American, from defense spending to woke historical revisionism. But if there ever was an American trap, Frédéric Pierrucci knows what it feels like being inside.
Hell, he wrote a memoir about it. But the book's title alone cannot do justice to what it felt like being locked up behind the freezing bars of a maximum security prison in Rhode Island, with the key thrown into the Providence River Delta. Or worse still, handed to the invisible generals in America's economic statecraft against its own ally.
Frédéric was a senior executive at French industrial giant Alstom, and is falling into the throes of a late 1970s US law written to combat corporate money laundering is in his own telling, exclusively explained by General Electric's predatory acquisition of Alstom's power and grid capabilities in 2015, among the world's largest ever industrial acquisitions.
America is waging economic war against its supposed allies, Frédéric argues, and it is high time that we meet fire with fire. GE has lately run into its own share of trouble and seems to no longer want to go nuclear. But the stain of Frédéric's book-form tale in the otherwise cordial history of transatlantic economic ties can hardly be erased. If this episode succeeds in sparking a rethink on either side of the Atlantic, rubbing salt in the wound will have been worth the effort.
Was Frédéric's American trap merely an anecdote of our global economy becoming more and more hostile and competitive? Or are Europe and America frenemies in denial? Maître Laurent Cohen-Tanugi is a French legal délicatesse at the New York Bar and a vice president at the Jacques Delors Institute. But he isn't one to throw around terms like economic war lightly, so his pushback against Pierucci's drum beating will likely spare this episode a DOJ investigation. Enjoy, and don't forget to rate and review us, as it always puts a smile on our face to see your support and helps us keep getting fantastic guests week after week. Thank you very much to both Laurent Cohen-Tanugi and Frédéric Pierrucci to be on Common Decency. Laurent, you're a lawyer, you're a member of the Paris and New York Bar, as well as the VP of the Institut Jacques Delors, and the founder of Laurent Cohen-Tanugi Avocat. Frédéric Pierrucci, you're founding partner of the compliance risk management consultancy firm Icarian, and the author of the best-selling The American Trap, My Battle to Expose America's Secret Economic War Against the Rest of the World. Thank you both for coming on the show. Before we begin covering the question of today, which is the question of economic sovereignty, I want to talk a little bit about Frédéric Pierrucci's personal experience, which is very relevant to this conversation and the main reason why you're such an important actor on this issue. So Frédéric, you were an employee of a French multinational Alstom, and in 2014, while you just set foot on American soil after a flight, you were arrested. Can you tell us why you were arrested, what happened to you over the past 7 years, and after we get this experience, it'd be interesting to see if Monsieur Cohen-Tanugi has also some similar experiences he can share with us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very long story, so I'll try to shorten it a little bit. I was a senior executive of a French company called Alstom. So just maybe for the sake of everybody, just remind everybody what was Alstom. Alstom was one of the top French company involved in three big sectors: power generation, power transmission, and transportation. So we are manufacturing high-speed train and so on. So the strategy of the company back in the 2010 was on the power generation side to merge our activities with the ones of our competitor in China, Shanghai Electric. And on the transport side, it was to have our Russian client, basically partners, to take an equity stake in the company. So I was at that time the head of one of the big division of the company, and my division was to be the test of this merger with the Chinese competition. So I did for 2 years a carve out of the company. I moved the headquarters from Paris to Singapore, negotiated with the Chinese joint venture. So I arrived there in Singapore in August 2012. And I was traveling very often to the United States because I had about 700 people to manage over there. And when I traveled there in April 2013, I got arrested as I was stepping out of the plane at JFK airport. So the main problem is that I didn't know I had been indicted. My indictment had been kept sealed because if you are a French citizen, that's what they do. So I was basically accused of having participated in a bribery scheme 10 years back. And what the prosecutor from the Department of Justice explained to me was that 10 years ago, Alstom won a contract in Indonesia using 2 consultants. And at that time, I was aware that Alstom had hired those consultants, and therefore I should have known that those consultants were going to use some of their remuneration to pay bribes to win a contract. So it's a long story, but basically I spent 14 months, first of all, in a high security prison, pending either trial or, in fact, after a few months, I pled guilty. And if you want, we can explain to the audience how this is working in the US. But out of 100 people indicted, 90% plead guilty to avoid a very long prison time. And during that period, I studied at length the law that was used by the United States to basically arrest me, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. And I discovered a lot of things when I studied the law in detail. To cut a long story short, at the end of the day, my company was very much destabilized by this inquiry into investigation inside the company, and 2/3 of the company was sold to our biggest competitor at that time, which was General Electric. So I'm sure we'll go through this in more detail, but this is the bulk of the story.
And I really recommend people go over and read your book, The American Trap. It is a terrifying personal experience because you had to be in high security prisons in America for a very long time, and also a kind of fascinating inquiry on the way the American judicial system worked in that scenario. But Monsieur Cohen-Tanugi, from your experience, is Monsieur Pierucci's story an exception, or have you in the past seen similar scenarios?
No, it's not an exception. There have been other similar cases. Not too many, fortunately, but that exist. And myself, I have been involved in a case in a somewhat relatively more favorable situation, in the sense that I am representing another French executive of a French multinational company who has been also indicted, not on corruption charges, but on some other economic regulation charges against the company. And that person has been indicted, but contrary to Mr. Pierucci, the indictment was officially notified while she was still in France. So she was not arrested, and I was able to organize her defense from France, which has its limitations and complications, but it is a much more favorable position than Frédéric Pierrucci has been in.
And so let's take kind of a general look at the situation, because Alstom was the 5th company which was acquired in full or partially by General Electric after the opening of a corruption inquiry from the Department of Justice. The 5th company, there's a bit of a pattern here. Under the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, we've seen some 36 fines that were worth $100 million or more. And of these 36 fines, 27 of them were paid by non-American companies, including a vast majority of European companies. So, there's a bit of a pattern here. How has the United States managed to build this, which is a very impressive legislative arsenal? How has it managed to do that in the past decades? and how has he used his legislative arsenals to push forward American economic interests? Maybe Frederic first.
Yes, just a little bit of history. This law, this FCPA, was enacted in 1977 after a major scandal, which was involving Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of aircraft, who basically recognized that he had paid bribes all over the world. So at that time, Carter decided to criminalize corruption of public officials, and the FCPA law was enacted. The problem is that it created asymmetry and a disadvantage for American companies against their competitors, especially European and Japanese competitors, because in Europe and in Japan, all the multinational companies were going to their Ministry of Finance to declare the bribes they were paying overseas, and it was deductible from their income statement. And that lasted until basically 1998 and 2000. So during this first phase, those American companies who were at a disadvantage put a lot of pressure on US Congress so that the law did not really apply. In fact, you had 1 or 2 cases per year. That's always very small fines. But then in 1998, the law was transformed, and it became extra-territorial, in meaning that before 1998, it applied only to US company. After 1998, it applied to every company in the world who had the slightest link with the US territory. And the US used basically 2 channels to make sure that everybody's under US law. The first channel is the US dollar and the SWIFT system. Every time you make a contract in US dollar, you are linked to the US territory, and therefore the law applies. And the other thing, the other channel is a channel of the internet, with especially the GAFA. So if you use emails who are stored or transit through US server, basically you touch US territory, and therefore the law similarly applies. So what we see is that from 1998, there's a big increase in fines. And it really starts in the year 2005. Up to in 2005, the US Department of Justice and US Treasury collected about $10 million fine worldwide by applying the FCPA. Last year, it was almost 3 billion. So you had an exponential use of the FCPA after it became extraterritorial, and the main target has been European companies. As you rightly said, about 2/3 of the fines are actually paid by European companies. So it started with British ones, British Aerospace, with Norwegian, Statoil, French one, Alcatel, Total, Technip, German ones, Italians, and so on.
And so, Laurent, is that your experience as well?
Well, I would like to nuance a little bit what has been said, particularly in the question. There's this whole rhetoric about economic war and this sort of quasi-conspiracy theories between the link between anti-corruption enforcement and acquisitions and all that. Again, there's a little bit of a conspiracy theory here. One thing that Frederic didn't mention is that in 1997, the OECD entered into, OECD member countries entered into the Anti-Bribery Convention, which means that the same principles as the SCPA were adopted by all the OECD member states. And then the member states had to implement national legislation to incorporate pretty much the same principle, which took a bit of time, and certainly in terms of enforcing the then national laws, that took even longer. When you look at the figures over the years, there's been a period where, in fact, non-US companies and European companies had to pay the largest fines because they were sort of late in the game, and it took a while for companies to adjust to the new rules. As Frederic mentioned, until 2000, bribes paid by French companies were tax deductible with the blessing of the Minister of Finance. So it took some time for European and French companies in particular to adapt. But if you look at the longer period, fines and number of prosecution are pretty even between US and non-US companies. And if you look at the most recent years, in particular 2020, you'll see that the focus has shifted. First of all, that in 2020, there are actually more US company prosecution than non-US companies. And as far as non-US companies are involved, Asian companies and Latin American companies are more targeted now. And the reason why is that European companies have had more time to adapt, and also European governments have started, and I'm sure we'll talk about this some more. European governments have started to take care of their own companies, which they were not doing until recently.
And there's this was fascinating, you both, and one of the reasons we're really happy to bring you together and kind of share perspectives is to try to parse out what is verifiable facts from what Mr. Cohen-Tanugi was I think rightly characterizing as perhaps more in the realm of conspiracy, but I think that regardless, I mean, the reality, I think, and the bite and of Mr. Pierucci's testimony is that regardless of kind of what's the origin, these major European industrial players are being hardly hit by the ability of U.S. law to be implemented outside of the country's borders, and this really leads us into kind of the main contention and which is how you see the larger issue here playing out. It seems like we're entering a phase, for instance, in European industrial policy, where we are beginning to see a lot more rhetoric around industrial champions and how we can help them compete on the global playing field. And so what are some of the ways that Europe, for instance, could be emulating what we've seen the United States do over the years, particularly since this law in particular? What are some of the ways that you see the global competition, really not just in Europe but worldwide, evolve in ways that ratchet up this sort of extra territoriality?
I mean, the first and most important way, in my view, and that's what European governments have started to do, is to, as I said, enforce their own laws against their own companies. And that's the approach taken by France with the Loi Sapin II in 2016, by the UK with the UK Bribery Act a couple of years earlier than that. And I think Germany has now a bill that it goes in the same direction, that incorporates what is called non-trial resolution, negotiated resolutions, like the deferred prosecution agreement in the US, and actually enforce those laws. And that actually works, because if you look at one of the biggest resolution of last year, the Airbus case, for example, there clearly the lead was taken by France and the UK, and the US DOJ took a back seat, and both in terms of the persecution itself and in the fines. And so we are seeing, and we're going to see more and more what is called multi-jurisdictional resolution and international cooperation, where the countries that have the strongest interest in the prosecution will take the lead. So I think, to me, that's the best way. The second way is, of course, to when there's an abuse, and particularly when there's a conflict of substance between various countries, and Europe and the United States, for example. And right now, there's only one domain, which is the Iranian sanctions, because the Trump administration, as you know, quit the Iran nuclear agreement. and that created a real foreign policy and legal conflict. But in all the other areas, whether it's anti-corruption or tax fraud or other things, the laws are aligned. So there's no reason why there should not be cooperation in enforcing those laws. But when there's an abuse, when there's a conflict, then Europe must have tools to counter the extraterritorial application of U.S. law.
And Monsieur Pierucci, you were obviously, a senior executive at a major European industrial giant. What's kind of your perspective and kind of bringing that from your experience from the corporate world into these larger issues? How do you see them?
As you can imagine, we don't quite agree on some of the issues here. I think at the end of the day, you need to be very factual on all this. I spent 25 months just looking at every single case of FCPA, both corporate and individual case. When you do a very detailed analysis, you see this asymmetry is very blatant. I just give you an example. In the power generation industry, there were basically 4 major competitors in the world. Alstom, ABB, Siemens, and the Japanese, plus the Americans. So all of them, all the non-American company, Alstom, ABB, Siemens, Hitachi, all got fined by the U.S. Department of Justice for infringement of the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. And that happened, as rightly said, since 1998, since the law became extraterritorial. But on the opposite side, since 1977, the law applies to American companies, who are involved in the same sector. And you have many, many American companies in the power generation sector: GE, Westinghouse, Bechtel, Sargent & Lundy, and so on. You have tens of them. In 50 years, the FBI has never been able to find a single case of an American power generation company breaching this law. So you can call it conspiracy, whatever you want. At the end of the day, there's a big asymmetry of sanctions, and they don't look the same way at American companies, at European companies. So we can always say European companies are late in bringing compliance into their culture, which is true. But I don't think compliance is always also in the culture of American companies, especially in oil and gas, power generation, telecommunication sector. So this analysis I've just done on power generation, you can do it exactly on the telecom business side, on telecom sector. You can do it in the oil and gas sector. Big oil and gas company in the US have never been indicted, have never breached the FCPA according to the Department of Justice. So the Chevron, Exxon, and so on never breached anything in 50 years, whereas Total, Eni, Statoil, and so on breached it. So what became very obvious, it became very obvious in fact under Trump, because Trump did not disguise, as it was done before by previous president, the fact that he's using the law as an economic weapon. And I will give you a few examples of this. When back in last year, you had William Barr, the head of the Department of Justice, who declared that just after having put a $1 billion fine to Ericsson, that US investors should buy either Nokia or Ericsson to control the 5G network. Okay, and it's at the same time where I've put a big indictment on a Huawei CFO. So this is a clear message that the Department of Justice, is playing a very strong economical role. It would be inconceivable for the French Ministry or Minister of Justice to say that in the economic interest of the country, a French company or French investor should buy this and this company abroad. So, but under Trump, this became very obvious. He also mentioned several times that, for instance, he could do something to release or to settle the case of the Huawei CFO if he could come to an agreement between China and the US on the economic war. So here it shows that he has a direct link with the Department of Justice, and basically the Department of Justice is doing whatever the executive power is saying. So, and you have many examples like this. You have the same example with a Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany. So how we are reacting to this in Europe? At least now we have started to realize what's going on. It costed us $14 billion in France before we started to realize this. That's the amount of fines that a French company have paid over the last 10 years for having infringed various extraterritorial US laws. So as Laurent just mentioned, we reacted by enacting in 2016 the Sapin II law, and the Sapin II law was done as a reaction of the Alstom case, where basically we lost, in addition to the fine, we lost the control of our nuclear power plants. So we reacted to this, and we decided two things. One, we decided to impose on all the French companies above a certain size to implement a strong compliance program, which I fully agree with Laurent. It was very necessary to put this. And we used also this law to basically try to repatriate into France some of the cases which were under investigation by the US and by the UK. So first, we managed to settle the Société Générale case. Société Générale was under investigation by the US authorities for the last few years. And thanks to the Sapin II law, we were able to make a deal with the Department of Justice, and the fine was paid 50% in the US, 50% into France. And then with the Airbus case, where also Airbus was under investigation by the UK and the US for several years, and thanks to the Sapin II law, we were able to get 2/3 of the 3 billion fines paid to the French Treasury instead of the US Treasury. So this law is a defensive law. It enables us to make sure that to be able to treat the cases of French company in France. The UK has done the same. Other countries are doing the same, but there's no real coordination at European level to do this, because it's a criminal prosecution. So therefore, it's every state who's basically acting on its own to try to define its own companies. And there have been a lot of books and reports published because you had a parliamentary inquiry after the Alstom case, where a lot of people were heard in the French parliament about this. So at least we woke up in France now. I think it's a major step. We woke up. It has costed us a lot before we woke up, but at least now we are moving forward.
If we have time, I'd like just to
go ahead.
Nuance a little bit a couple of things that Frédéric said. First of all, I don't have a sector by sector analysis of the prosecutions and fines, but all I know that many U.S. companies are prosecuted and fined by the U.S. government in many sectors. The other important thing that we should not make, I'm certainly not going to defend the Trump administration and its undue interference with the independence of the Justice Department, but the reality is that most of the fines and the prosecutions against European companies were done under the Obama administration. So it's not at all. I think we should mix the aggressivity of the Trump administration, which really waged an economic war, not only against Europe but also against China and others, with the regular enforcement of the FCPA or of sanctions, which is a constant and which was particularly strong under a democratic administration. So these are really two different things that we should not mix.
No, for that I fully agree, Laurent. I mean, whoever is at the top of the country, it is going to be the same. But the administration who has really industrialized the FCPA against and weaponized the FCPA against European companies is really Obama. You are perfectly right. Just nobody said anything when it was Obama. We had to wait until Trump basically said loudly what Obama was doing quietly, but we started
that's where I disagree. I don't think Obama was doing anything quietly. Obama had an independent Justice Department that's enforcing the laws, whereas Trump was unduly intervening in judicial affairs. It's two very different things. And as you noted, Frederic, yourself, I mean, those European companies were actually paying bribes. There's no denying; they all acknowledged it. And so the question is, who sanctions them? If it's not their own governments, then it will be the U.S. And as far as the acquisition of by GE, it was also the decision of the CEO of Alstom, as you very well know. So you also have to hold accountable the management of those companies, and not only the U.S. authorities. There's also a big responsibility of the management of those companies.
Yeah, and it's really great again to have the kind of the blend of and experience and sort of legal reasoning that both of you bring to sort of have that be in dialogue so that we can better kind of envision what it is we're facing. And I wonder precisely on what Cohen-Tanugi was alluding to, whether we're looking at a friendlier scenario with the new White House that is already signaling that it is open to using multilateral for the OECD is one example, but I think others could be thought of. And we have in the Biden administration, I think a partner where the concerns that you both are bringing up are perhaps going to find a better audience. So I think what I wanted to ask you is there any sort of multilateral way that a lot of these wrinkles get solved, or because I did find that some of the comments that Monsieur Pierucci made were really interesting. You did mention also specifically the French case where a lot of these companies, that they do and bring these concerns up to the French Treasury, they get they don't get the same sort of attention, but it's not, and we've seen President Macron, I think, building up a whole layer of his vision for strategic autonomy around industrial policy, and going about helping industrial champions at the European level in a more deliberate sort of way that takes account of the actual market conditions that in worldwide that you're mentioning. So taking into account that we do have a more Macron setting the tone for this sort of conversation on the European side, but also a new Biden administration. Are you hopeful that these things eventually get solved out in a multilateral fashion?
Well, I mean, again, we should really distinguish domain. When you talk about industrial policy, you're really talking about competition law, antitrust, and all that. That's really a conversation for the Europeans. It's an old story, and the French are always pushed for industrial policy and criticize the EU competition law. Whether that's going to evolve now, that will obviously require the consent of other member states, particularly Germany. So that's one conversation. The other topic is whether we're going to see more international cooperation between the US and Europe. And my answer is yes, probably, as long as France, the UK, Germany continue to participate in the fight against transnational corruption and other economic delinquents. There will be more of these multi-jurisdictional settlements that we've seen with Airbus. I think yes. I think the Biden administration will be certainly inclined to favor those.
Monsieur Pierucci.
Well, I think at the end of the day, whoever you have at the White House is not going to change much. The fact that the US economically doesn't want to have competitors in Europe. We will see what happens. But of course, laws like the Sapin II law in France and UK Bribery Act are going to help to raise the level of compliance inside in French and European companies. But what I would like to see is the opposite in the US, on US industries. Who's going to put the pressure on US companies to also stop paying bribes all over the world? I mean, it's striking that we seem to be always the bad guys who are paying bribes to win contracts. I mean, look at what all American companies are doing in many countries. They have been winning contracts, paying bribes in many countries. Look at Saudi Arabia or whatever. And they've never been really caught or prosecuted by their administration. If you look at why you have US companies on the top FCPA list, it's mainly because those investigations have been started against US companies abroad. That's why the US government has been able to repatriate those cases, and there are no other options than to put a fine on their companies. But if you look at Alcoa case, Halliburton case, more recently this year, Goldman Sachs case, it was never the US who really started the investigation against their own company. It was started abroad. So we should not be naive in this. Okay, we are going to raise the level of compliance in our companies, but if we want really to stop the attack using extraterritorial laws by the Department of Justice, we will need to fight back at one point in time. And that's what we were able to do 25 years ago on antitrust, because the US also put big fines on antitrust against a European company at that time. And at that time, okay, we were not 27, we are a much smaller number. And what we did is that we fought back. We also put big fines to US companies on antitrust. The result being that now everybody is looking at after their own companies and no longer trying to target the other side. On anti-corruption, we're not yet there right now. Right now, we are more on a defensive side. What we have to take into account as well is that, okay, we're talking about anti-corruption, but you have other extraterritorial laws. For instance, everything regarding sanctions, everything regarding the Cloud Act and the transfer of personal data. Every year or 2 years, you have a new extraterritorial law which applies to European companies. So therefore, we have to build an arsenal of French and European laws, which we start to do with RGPD and so on, every time to counter those US laws. And this is not easy. And tomorrow, we're going to have the same thing coming from China. Because, of course, China is starting to be also targeted by the US. We've seen the Huawei case or the ZTE case. And China is building now its own legal arsenal of laws which will become extraterritorial one day. The first one being on export control, which was enacted 1st of December 2020. So where they are going to basically respond to the OFAC of the US side. So the world is going to be very, very complex for companies going forward, because for one single contract, you are going to have multiple laws applying to it, both on the export control and on the corruption, but also on data and data protection. And this is going to be more and more complicated for compliance officer to play their role and for legal counsel to play their role. And it's a great opportunity for law firm, because you're going to have conflict of laws more and more often going forward.
So speaking of China, Mr. Pierucci, your book was a major bestseller in China after Meng Wanzhou, she's the daughter of the founder of Huawei and the CFO of a company. She was arrested in Canada following an extradition request from the United States. So let's talk more generally about the situation. It's about the situation in the United States. It's, last question, but where do you see the EU EU's position amid the trade conflict between China and the United States. How much should they kind of leverage the situation to rebalance its relationship with the United States? And to what extent should it also side with the United States over China? Maybe Laurent first?
Well, I think this is, again, a very different topic than the question of the extraterritorial application of US law. The situation with Huawei is part of, here we can really talk about economic war or technological competition, which with sort of military and strategic implications. This is something that's, and here we have some dangerous, potentially dangerous and even troublesome behavior where, somebody's arrested in Canada and then the Chinese arrest two Canadian citizens who have nothing to do with the situation, and that's totally arbitrary. And that's really we're in a different game here. It's an arbitrary use of the law, and that's something that's very dangerous. As far as Europe's positioning in this conflict, economic and technological, I think that Europe has some diverging interests vis-a-vis China from the US, and also even within Europe, member states have very different attitudes. But on the whole, Europe and the United States have a very strong common interest in countering, especially the aggressivity of the current Chinese leadership. And so again, we should not confuse or mix potential disputes over the application of a law that is again common to the West, with the much more significant technological, economic, and potentially strategic competition between the West and China. These are two very different things, and Europe should not be mistaken in trying to play arbiter or between the two. We clearly are on the Western side here.
So, Mr. Pierucci, maybe a few words on your celebrity in China after that Meng Wanzhou's case, and a few words on the trade tensions between the United States and China, and what you think Europe can make out of it.
Well, I think the country who has been the most aggressive against European company has been clearly the US. So far, not China. If you look at the history of fines being paid by European company, if you look at the history of spying on European companies, I think it looks like everybody forgot what Snowden told us in 2013. What did he tell us? Is that he told us that the NSA was working with more than 100 American companies, the GAFAM, to spy systematically on all Europeans and on all European companies. And there was a specific document which described that the NSA was particularly targeting all companies in France who were negotiating contracts above $200 million. So it means that every single manager of big French company were basically taped and spied on by the NSA. So if you call this regular economic system, I would strongly disagree. So right now, why they are fighting against China on the 5G is that is because they are 2 years late compared to Huawei. So it will be much more complicated for the NSA to spy on Huawei equipment, 5G equipment, than on Ericsson, Nokia, or Cisco equipment.
And how about China spying on US and European companies, Frederic? You're not concerned about that?
I'm very concerned about that. That's why I'm very concerned that the Chinese are going to do exactly the same as the US is doing.
Yeah, except that the US are strategic allies, not the Chinese. I mean, that's a big difference.
well, my view is that we should have a third route. We don't have to align neither with the US nor with China. I think we are the World War II is finished for the last 75 years. The Cold War is finished for the last 30 years. It's about time that Europe wakes up and be a third route and be strategically independent from the United States, both legally, numerically, and also military. That's the problem. Right now, we are still living in a post-World War II world. I'm very worried about both sides right now, and but the ones who has been the most aggressive so far has been the US over the last few years. China is a potential threat. I agree with you. So that's why I will not align with neither of them. And I think it's very important for French companies, specifically, to regain sovereignty on very strong, very specific assets, very specific industries. We cannot afford to be the vassal of the US. Sorry, I don't want to live in this world where we continue to be the vassal of the US.
No, I agree, but I think legally it's within reach for Europe. In terms of militarily, I think we are far from it, unfortunately.
Well, I really cannot stress enough to the both of you how worthwhile these kinds of conversations are for us, and we hope for a broader public. And we're really appreciative that you agreed to the concept of this this episode. And we are very cognizant that these issues are very sensitive for the both of you. And really our whole hope was to kind of begin from Frédéric's very harrowing story. It's a story that it really is very compelling, and it really needs to be looked at, and to try to enlarge the focal lens towards perhaps some of the larger picture that can be gleaned, and some of what you both have alluded to, I think, goes in that direction. You've mentioned the case of Iran, sanctions, some privacy issues, but I think it's really such an important conversation to have. And we began with the sort of the issue of how the extra-territorial application of this very niche law, what strikes one as a very niche law, but it really hints at a larger problem, which is we're in a world that seems to be evolving. I think on this much we can get you both to agree. We're evolving towards more economic statecraft, more lawfare, as Monsieur Pierucci alluded to, and companies are getting caught in the crossfire, and that's we're so appreciative that you working in that sort of environment, you've agreed to the concept of this show, and I think we have succeeded in making it relevant. So really, thank you both so much for agreeing to this. Again, Mr. Cohen-Tanugi is a lawyer at both the Paris and the New York bar, and he's also a vice president at the Jacques Delors Institute. And Frédéric Pierrucci is obviously best-selling author. Go get yourself a copy of The American Trap, and he was a senior executive at Alstom. So thank you both again so much, and we look forward to discussing with you again on another occasion. So, Frédéric Pierrucci and Laurent Cohen-Tanugi are out. What did you think of this episode, Francois?
First of all, I'm so very glad we're able to have them both on the show. I read Frédéric's book a year and a half ago, and I remember being, first of all, so shocked by the personal experience he lived through. I highly recommend people go and give it a read, because he is treated like some kind of maximum security threat to America. He is surrounded by Russian mobsters and drug dealers and criminals and pedophiles. Very dangerous. He has all these horrendous prison experiences that you can imagine, those kind of maximum security prisons. So that part was, I thought, really shocking and makes for a very gripping book. And the other part which was shocking is the other side of the book, which is the way America uses some of its legal tools to advance America's economic interests. And it's a natural thing for states to do. but it is done with incredible energy and at times, in Frédéric's case, viciousness, because his life was pretty much destroyed for 5 years. So I really recommend everyone to go give a book a read, because it gives a powerful overview of these topics, because he is one of the leading experts on the question of economic sovereignty and economic warfare. There's a reason, because when he was in prison, he had 1 hour per day in which he could use internet, and he used that 1 hour per day to, first of all, work on his case, but most importantly, read on all the history of similar companies who had ended up being investigated by the DOJ, and then the General Electric or another company would come in and buy a part of a European company being investigated by the DOJ. So I highly recommend people go over it, and it's an important insight on US-EU relations that people need to take into account. We're allies, and we've always been, but that does not stop us from sometimes having light economic warfare in the shadows.
Yeah, and it is a pretty important point to stress that this was kind of a bombshell when it came out on French media. I think Frédéric did a sort of a radio taped series where he kind of goes in some depth of some of the events you describe, and it really was a massive success when the book came out. And I think he was aided by a French journalist at Le Nouvel Observateur, what was still at the time Le Nouvel Observateur. Now they're called L'Obs. Some journalist helped him out in writing the book. And legitimately so. I mean, this was a bombshell, because it is a bombshell. And and I was also pretty interested in what you shared with what Frédéric shared with you and us about his book being also a massive success in China. And we can get into some of why that happened towards the end. But yes, I mean, I do concur. I think at the heart of this whole tale is just the sheer pain of like Frédéric's experience. Like, why the hell did this happen? Why did a senior executive at a leading industrial giant worldwide? I mean, Alstom is a worldwide institution. Why did he have to endure this harrowing, experience of being locked up in a high security prison? I was even, before we went live, I was asking you why wouldn't he ask his prison guards to be afforded, allotted some sort of luxury spot within Rikers, much in the way that the old school, capo di capi of the Italian American mafia used to have. Why wasn't he able to carve out some luxuries and some little, even just some amenities within Rikers? Because it is a pretty harrowing experience for a senior executive to be locked up alongside mobsters and criminals, real criminals. I mean, not blue collar criminals. I do think that one kind of thread that kind of reemerges across the episode is the difference between what initially in the 1970s was written as a bill to combat genuine money laundering. I mean, as you and I were discussing just a second ago, money laundering is a real problem across the developed world. We have like a lot of almost like kleptocratic practices where businesses bid for contracts in very untoward ways, right? They afford themselves the illegality of paying bribes to public officials in order to win contracts, and that's a huge problem, and it's a real problem. And I think America is absolutely right to want to design a legal architecture where it is able to combat those kinds of practices, and in other countries and other companies operating in America primarily. And I mean, again, this was an American industrial giant looking to have Alstom's energy branch merge into its energy capabilities, right? So I do think there's like grounds for America to want to have those kinds of practices like monitored and governed, right? What I do concur is not legitimate is for that initial architecture to be used like 30 years, 40 years down the line in some sort. And like I do think like there's we should probably get some lawyer friends into the episode someday to discuss this, but I do think there's even some prosecutorial issues with how the American prosecutors, essentially like went back to this very old bill to do something that had, I think in the eyes of like just even like a lot of like American lawyers, very little to do with this 1970s law. And we would need to go back to the case that was made at the time. But this is the gap between the tool and the purpose is pretty striking in this case. What the bill was written to accomplish and what it was used to accomplish at a specific point in time. In this case, Pierucci's case. And I would be really interested in hearing you. And I know you've got a lot to say, but I would be really interested in hearing your experience as a French reader of Pierucci's book, whether or not you would have gotten the same chills reading about Frédéric's experience had this been a German businessman locked up in Rikers.
No, I think so. There's this humanity about this book, which makes you connect with it. The fact he's French made me worried about my country more than it made me worried about this person in particular. I think had he been, Chinese, I'd have had exactly the same reaction. But the reason why this law changed since the 1970s, essentially it was a response to the kind of American malaise of the 1970s of corruption and whatnot. But quite quickly, American companies complained that they were being beaten by foreign competition who could give bribes and not them. And they changed the nature of the law to make it extra-territorial and create a level playing field.
Yeah.
But essentially, as much as America is exploiting that law, there's also a case to be made that Europeans have been too naive and should have, first of all, too naive with the United States, but also too naive with their own companies. The reason why the Americans prosecutors were able to push out some of this file is because the French government didn't push out some in the first place. Had these cases been taken into account in France and had French prosecutors actually prosecuted Alstom in France, there wouldn't have been a case for America to do that. The reason they did it is because France didn't do it. So there needs to be kind of a larger effort in compliance. And something else he tells, which I think was really damning for France and probably for most European countries, is as a senior executive of kind of a very strategic company, if a scenario like that happens, you should be prepared. You should know what to do. And he was arrested. He had no idea that was possible. And he had no idea what to say. He had no idea what means to use. And so he was completely, the DOJ ran circles around Alstom and Pierucci in particular. I think now this is not the case. I think Pierucci and others have done a great job making sure that senior executives know the risk they face and know what to do if such a scenario presents itself.
I'm
but
sure
it says a lot about how naive we were, and I think it's moving on a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of corporate policies were rolled out at the time worldwide, not just at Alstom, to monitor some of the travel of their executives, adjusted for the legal jeopardy that they could find themselves in would they travel to a jurisdiction where the legitimate grounds for them to be eventually prosecuted would it almost reminded me of a DSK's case because I was watching when we did this episode a couple of weeks back. I was watching the new Netflix special on Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who also for a whole host of different reasons found himself in the throes of a pretty solid legal architecture to combat sexual criminality. Obviously try to sneak out through the back door and didn't work out well for him. He was prosecuted in New York. And so it kind of reminded me, it was almost funny that we did it at a time when this new Netflix special was being rolled out. But in any event, it was so great to have Frédéric and Laurent share their thoughts, and Frédéric's very harrowing experience with us. Do remember to rate it and review us on every podcasting platform, whichever one is your favorite. And we do look forward to welcoming you for another episode next week.
See you next week.